In this lesson, we're going to talk about how we can use scene states to further enhance the use of render elements. Alright, so a couple lessons back, we had talked about how we could use render elements as a way of separating out some of our different properties that we see here in our rendered image. Now, this is good for if we just need to separate out these elements that we see. But in a lot of situations, you may have times where you need to use something like ambient occlusion to maybe get a little bit enhanced detail, or maybe some other kind of special shaders that need to be applied to your particular scene, maybe to just pull out one particular element. Now, in that kind of a situation, let's say if we needed to use another ambient occlusion pass, we really could not use this render elements to do that. Right? It's pretty much just built to separate out the objects that we see here. So in this case, we could use something called scene states to give this the effect that we need. Alright, so let me go ahead and just close some of these things out. Let's delete this out of the batch render from where we left it in the previous lesson. Now, a scene state can be found right up here underneath Tools and Manage Scene States. Alright, it's going to pull open this little dialog box, and we can now save all of these different things as they exist right now. So all the light properties as they're set right now, any transforms, any object properties, so whether an object is set to cast or receive shadows, be a caustics generator, all these different things can be saved at this point. Also things like materials, layer assignments, everything will be saved in a snapshot as it exists right now. So we can call this something like color pass. Alright, so all the materials, all the lights, everything is set up right now to give me this result as my final render. So now let's come in and we'll generate a new material. This is going to be just like what we had done previously whenever we were building our ambient occlusion. We'll call this occlusion. And let's build our material real quickly. We'll take our ambient diffuse, set those to black, give this a self-illumination color. And that's going to be our occlusion map. Maybe 32 samples. And let's say in a ballpark figure of maybe 10 as the max distance. Alright, now a couple lessons back we talked about how we could use material overrides. Now what we can do instead, now that we have all of our settings saved as a scene state, we can always go back to that at any time we want. So what that means now is if we select all of our different objects, and let's take this occlusion material, drag it on, and we'll assign it to everything that we currently have selected. Alright, excellent. And so now when we render, we should now have our occlusion. And what we can do, now that we have everything set as far as our materials go, we can come in and save a new scene state. Let's go back and make sure that I can spell this correctly. Occlusion. Alright, so now what we can do is at any time we can come back to, let's say, the color pass, restore that. There we go. And now we're right back to where we were. We need to get back to the occlusion, restore that, and there we go. So you really can kind of think of this like your own personal render passes, but really they can contain a lot more information than just render information. You can move objects around, set object properties, really adjust a lot of things between these different settings. Really, it's just kind of a snapshot of what your scene existed or consisted of at that point in time. Right. And here in a second we'll see how this can really be used as the kind of rendering helper for us. Now, if we go back to the render setup, what's going to happen is if we were to just simply batch render this out to use both the occlusion pass and this color pass, if we were to come into the batch render, we can add, back in this viewport, we can choose something like a scene state, and this time we'll choose the color pass, so that way whenever it renders out in this view 1, it'll render everything that was set in this color pass. If we add another one, we can set this to be the occlusion scene state. So you can kind of see now where we're going with this. We can set up two different batch renders, one to render color and one to render occlusion. Now the problem becomes, if we were to render out this occlusion pass, it is going to use the render elements as well, because that's what we had it set to use here in our render setup. So what we can do is make our own special presets for the color pass and for the occlusion pass. So with everything set up the way I want, we have color pass where we're using things like caustics, using the render elements. Everything is set the way I want, so I'm going to save this as a preset. So I'll use this, pull down, save preset, and we can call this something like render elements on. Save that. All right, everything's good. And now we can come back and let's just save all of this, or rather delete all of this out. So remove all of that. And we'll turn off anything that we don't need as far as indirect illumination. So caustics, we don't need those. And now we can save that as another render preset that does not use the render elements. All right, very good. So the reason that we can do that, or the reason that we would need to do that, is because now, if we go back to the batch render dialog, we can choose to use one of these presets. So in the color pass, choose something like the render elements on. So that way it utilizes all the render elements we had set up, utilizes all the indirect illumination that we had set up. Everything that we had set up whenever we save this preset will now get used. For this occlusion pass, we can use a totally different preset, something like render elements off. So we can tune the render setup to a per pass basis, or a per render basis. And so now whenever we render this out, this color pass should use all the settings that we need, and the occlusion pass should use all the settings that it needs. All right, so with this color pass, let's go ahead and give it an output path. Let's call this something like color pass, or whatever you want to call it. And we'll give this a targa format. Again, because this is going to be rendering out our different render elements, so we want to make sure that we do have something that has an alpha channel. And for the output of this occlusion pass, we'll give it something like occlusion, and then save that out. Hit OK. And now, whenever we render this out, it's going to go through and first render out the color pass. So it's going to go through this process, render that out, separate all the render elements, and then it'll actually come back and do a separate render where it renders out the occlusion pass with all the settings that we had defined for that particular render. All right, so once that's done, again, now we can see that here are the different render elements that were output from that first render using those different render settings that we had saved as our preset. And then here is the separate occlusion pass that was rendered separately, but using all the settings that we had defined for its render preset. All right, so that just kind of provides us with one extra element and one extra pass that we can, again, use to recomposite this back together. And this can be repeated over and over again for any kind of special shaders that you need to then recomposite to get your final render. So this now brings us to the conclusion of Introduction of Mental Ray in 3ds Max. So over the course of the past few hours, we've explored a number of different tools and features that Mental Ray has available within 3ds Max. So we started out by learning how we can use global illumination as well as Final Gather to achieve the effects of indirect lighting. And we also saw how we can take a lot of this indirect illumination data and save it for use during render time, really speeding up our renders. So we've also seen how we can use caustic photons to create the reflective and refractive light patterns. We've explored various Mental Ray materials, such as the subsurface shader, the car paint shader, ambient occlusion, and the architectural materials. We've also seen how we can use the render elements to split our renders into multiple passes at render time, as well as how we can composite those passes back together in another application. So the goal with this training is to give you a good start with Mental Ray and to get you familiar enough with the major features that now you can begin comfortably working with the application and using it for your own renders. So to continue your education and expand your skill set, I encourage you to visit us online where you'll find the latest announcements. Built on educational values, Digital Tutors started with a simple vision in mind: to help new and experienced artists become more productive by learning new software and production techniques. We've been a leading online resource for free video-based training and have been instrumental in aiding millions of artists on a daily basis. Learn more about the multitude of training solutions that we offer for various areas of the production pipeline at digitaltutors.com.